Good morning and welcome to this initial and inaugural Arts and Letters series that's being sponsored by the Davis Studio and Creative Space here in Shreveport, Louisiana. This morning we have a very interesting topic that deals with, indeed, the legacy, the writing, the history, the contribution of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. The readings and the works that we're going to talk about today will revolve around a testament of hope. Now, giving credit, of course, we want to make sure this volume has been edited and compiled by James M. Washington. And we're going to, first of all, try to set for you, if you will. Well, first of all, we want to thank Professor Natasha Davis for envisioning the idea of this Arts and Letters series as we go forth. And as I indicated, this is the inaugural, and there are many great things to come from this initiative. So we're indebted to her and the fine people who work on her staff. The introduction of this will have to involve, indeed, a historical perspective in terms of the life, the legacy, and the work of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. If we look at the historical perspective, of course, we look to the 1950s and the 1960s. Those of us who were around at that time will try to remember and reflect on the fact that this was a turbulent time. This was an exciting time, but by the same token, it was also a very dangerous time. It was a dangerous time for anyone who took the initiative to speak up for the rights of our people at the time. And looking at this text, we also find, and we look at the source of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's inspiration for his movement. And of course, it will be discussed some further in the program this morning, his impact that Mahatma Gandhi had on his movement. He was also a powerful speaker. He was a great orator. He was a great elocutionist. He realized and he used the power of the spoken word, and he used it quite effectively. We will deal this morning, of course, with, as I indicated, the text or the compilation, A Testament of Hope, that is compiled by Dr. James Washington. Now, this is a compilation of speeches, interviews, sermons, and writings of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. It was published in 1986, and it contains many of his previously unpublished works. There are 6 sections that you are going to listen to and be exposed to this morning. They are divided into 6 sections. The first deals with the religious impact and the religious implications of his struggle. And it takes a look at Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, connecting this to his religious beliefs. And this is beginning in his early childhood. Dr. King was deeply involved in the Baptist Church. And many pieces of this first section explore the relationship between his biblical messages of brotherly love and the long struggle for civil rights for our people. The second section is a social aspect, and it deals with his intent to integrate this country. And it mostly consists of Dr. King's pragmatic calls for immediate action. These works are more resonant with the wider civil rights movement that most of us are familiar with. The third section deals with how he treated and how he thought of politics. This is a particularly delicate balance, he thought, because it was wedged between democracy and Black nationalism. And for the record, everyone did not ascribe to his views. Everybody did not particularly follow that lead, but this is how he focused on facing the roadblocks that faced our people at the time. And this was a campaign to address the urgent civil rights needs of that time. The fourth section is a compilation of several of his most famous speeches. These will include, of course, the I Have a Dream speech, which he gave in 1963, and the I've Been to a Mountaintop speech, which he delivered the night before his assassination in 1968. The fifth section deals with King's most important essays. And in the audience, you will remember most of these come from, first of all, his letter from the Birmingham jail, which he wrote while he was in prison for engaging in a peaceful protest in Birmingham, Alabama. in 1963. And during this time, of course, King rebuked a lot of the conservatives who spent their time trying to squelch the activist movement or stalling progress in politics. And he directs much of his frustration to the political moderates who, through their inaction, he thought, were slowing or impeding the movement. The fifth and final section deals with interviews. This is a full transcript of Dr. King's discussions with a variety of institutions and people. These include his famous interviews with or on Face the Nation, Meet the Press, and also renowned psychologist Kenneth B. Clark. And collectively, these conversations give a multifaceted impression of Dr. King's personality. The listing of topics which you will be exposed to this morning include the following topics: give us the ballot, the power of nonviolence, the case against tokenism, the experiment in love, the most durable power, suffering and faith, the burning truth in the South, the current crisis, race relations, his speech before the Youth March for Integrated Schools, his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, his walk for freedom, who speaks for the South, our God is marching on, and finally, the American dream. My dear friends, you are indeed postured for an in-depth view of the legacy and the contributions of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. We thank you for joining us this morning, and indeed, you are sure to enjoy this presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Gilliam. Thank you, Professor Davis. Mr. Chairman, distinguished platform associates, fellow Americans. 3 years ago, the Supreme Court of this nation rendered in simple, eloquent, and unequivocal language a decision which will long be stenciled on the mental sheets of succeeding generations. For all men of goodwill, this May 17th decision came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of human captivity. It came as a great beacon light of hope in millions of disinherited people throughout the world who had dared only to dream of freedom. Unfortunately, this noble and sublime decision has not gone without opposition. This opposition has often risen to ominous proportions. Many states have risen up in open defiance. The legislative halls of the South ring loud with such words as interposition and nullification. But even more, all types of conniving methods are still being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. Denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandate of our democratic tradition. And so our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of an anti-lynching law. We will, by the power of our vote, write the law on the statute books of the South and bring an end to the dastardly acts of hooded perpetrators of violence. Give us the ballot, and we would transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot, and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill and send to the sacred halls of Congress men who will not sign a Southern manifesto because of their devotion to the manifesto of justice. Give us the ballot, and we will place judges on the benches of the South who would do justly and love mercy. And we will place at the head of the Southern states governors who have felt not only the tang of the human, but the glow of the divine. Give us the ballot, and we will quietly and nonviolently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the Supreme Court's decision of May 17th. In this juncture of our nation's history, there's an urgent need for dedicated and courageous leadership. If we are to solve the problems ahead and make racial justice a reality, this leadership must be fourfold. First, there's need for strong, aggressive leadership from the federal government. So far, only the judicial branch of the government has evinced this quality of leadership. And if the executive and the legislative branches of the government were as concerned about the protection of our citizen rights as the federal courts have been, then the transition from a segregated to an integrated society would be infinitely smoother. But we so often look to Washington in vain for this concern. In the midst of the tragic breakdown of law and order, the executive branch of the government is all too salient and apathetic. In the midst of the desperate need for civil rights legislation, the legislative branch of the government is all too stagnant and hypocritical. This dearth of positive leadership from the federal government is not confined to one particular political party. Both political parties have betrayed the cause of justice. The Democrats have betrayed it by capitulating to the prejudices and the undemocratic practices of the Southern Democrats. The Republicans have betrayed it by capitulating the blatant hypocrisy of right-wing reactionary Northerners. These men so often have a high blood pressure of words and an anemia of deeds. In the midst of these prevailing conditions, we come to Washington today pleading with the president and members of Congress to provide a strong, moral, and courageous leadership for a situation that cannot permanently be evaded. We come humbly to say to the men in the forefront of our government that the civil rights issue is not an ephemeral, evasive domestic issue that can be kicked about by reactionary guardians of the status quo. It is rather an eternal moral issue which may well determine the destiny of our nation. In the ideological struggle with communism, the hour is late. The clock of destiny is ticking on. We must act now before it is too late. The second area in which there's need for strong leadership is from the white Northern liberals. There's a dire need today for a liberalism which is truly liberal. What we are witnessing today in so many northern communities is a sort of quasi-liberalism, which is based on the principle of looking sympathetically at all sides. It is a liberalism so bent on seeing all sides that it fails to become committed to either side. It is a liberalism that is so objectively analytical that it is not subjectively committed. It is a liberalism which is neither hot nor cold, but lukewarm. We call for liberalism from the North, which will be thoroughly committed to the ideal of racial justice and will not be deterred by the propaganda and the subtle words of those who say, slow up for a while. You're pushing too fast. A third source that we must look to for strong leadership is from the moderates of the white South. It is unfortunate that at this time, the leadership of the white South stems from the close-minded reactionaries. These persons gain prominence and power by dissemination of false ideals and by deliberately appealing to the deepest hate responses within the human mind. It is my firm belief that this closed-minded, reactionary, recalcitrant group constitutes a numerical minority. There are in the white South more open-minded moderates that appears on the surface. These persons are silent today because of fear of social, political, and economic reprisals. God grant that the white moderates of the South would rise up courageously without fear and take up the leadership in this tense period of transition. I cannot close without stressing the urgent need for strong, courageous, and intelligent leadership from the Negro community. We need a leadership that is calm and yet positive. This is no day for rabble-rousers, whether he be Negro or white. We must realize that we are grappling with the most weighty social problems of this nation. And in grappling with such a complex problem, there's no place for misguided emotionalism. We must work passionately and unrelentlessly for the goal of freedom. But we must be sure that our hands are clean in the struggle. We must never struggle with falsehood, hate, or malice. We must never become bitter. I know how we feel sometimes. There's the danger that those of us who have been forced so long to stand amid the tragic midnight of oppression, those of us who have been trampled over, those of us who have been kicked about, there is the danger that we will become bitter. But if we will become bitter and indulge in hate campaigns, the new order which is emerging will be nothing but a duplication of the old order. We must meet hate with love. We must meet physical force with soul force. There's still a voice crying out through the vista of time saying, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you. Then and only then can you matriculate them to the university of eternal life. That same voice cries out in terms lifted to cosmic proportion. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. And history is replete with the bleached bones of nations that failed to follow this command. We must follow nonviolence and love. Now, I'm not talking about a sentimental shadow kind of love. I'm not talking about eros, which is a sort of aesthetic, romantic love. I'm not talking about philia, which is a sort of intimate affection between personal friends. But what I'm talking about is agape. I'm talking about the love of God in the hearts of men. I'm talking about a type of love which would cause you to love the person who does the evil deed while hating the deed that the person does. We've got to love. There's another warning signal. We talk a great deal about our rights, and rightly so. We proudly proclaim that 3/4 of the peoples of the world are colored. We have the privilege of noticing in our generation the great drama of freedom and independence as it unfolds in Asia and Africa. All of these things are in line with the unfolding work of providence. But we must be sure that we accept them in the right spirit. We must not seek to use our emerging freedom and our growing power to do the same thing to the white minority that has been done to us for so many centuries. Our aim must never be to defeat or to humiliate the white man. We must not become victimized with a philosophy of black supremacy. God is not interested merely in freeing black men and brown men and yellow men, but God is interested in freeing the whole human race. We must work with determination to create a society not where black men are superior and other men are inferior and vice versa, but a society in which all men will live together as brothers and respect the dignity and the worth of human personality. We must also avoid the temptation of being victimized with the psychology of victors. We have won marvelous victories through the work of the NAACP. We have been able to do some of the most amazing things of this generation. And I come this afternoon with nothing but praise for this great organization, the work that has already done and the work that it will do in the future. And although they're outlawed in Alabama and other states, the fact still remains that this organization has done more to achieve civil rights for Negroes than any other organization we can point to. Certainly, this is fine. But we must not, however, remain satisfied with the court victory over our white brothers. We must respond to every decision with our understanding of those who have opposed us, with an appreciation of the difficult adjustments that the court orders pose for them. We must act in such a way as to make possible a coming together of white people and colored people on the basis of real harmony of interest and understanding. We must seek an integration based on mutual respect. I conclude by saying that each of us must keep faith in the future. Let us not despair. Let us realize that as we struggle for justice and freedom, we have cosmic companionship. This is the long faith of the Hebraic Christian tradition, that God is not some Aristotelianism, unmoved mover who merely contemplates upon himself. He is not merely a self-knowing God, but an other-loving God, forever working through history for the establishment of his kingdom. Those of us who call the name of Jesus Christ find something of an event in our Christian faith that tells us this: there is something in our faith that says to us, never despair, never give up, never feel that the cause of righteousness and justice is doomed. There is something in our Christian faith at the center of it which says to us that Good Friday may occupy the throne for a day, but ultimately it must give way to the triumphant beat of the drum of Easter. There's something in our faith that says evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy the palace and Christ the cross. But one day that same Christ will rise up and split history into AD and BC, so that even the name, the life of Caesar, must be dated by his name. There's something in this universe which justifies Carly in saying no lie can live forever. There is something in this universe which justifies William Cullen Bryant in saying truth crushed the earth will rise again. There's something in this universe which justifies James Russell Lowell in saying truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold always the future, and behind the dim unknown stands God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. Go out with that faith. Go back to your homes in the Southland to that faith. With that faith today, go back to Philadelphia, to New York, to Detroit, and Chicago with that faith today, that the universe is on our side in the struggle. Stand up for justice. Sometimes it gets hard, but it is always difficult to get out of Egypt, for the Red Sea always stands before you with the discouraging dimension. And even after you cross the Red Sea, you have to move through a wilderness with prodigious hilltops of evil and gigantic mountains of opposition. But I say to you this afternoon, keep moving. Let nothing slow you up. Keep moving. Move on with dignity and honor and respectability. I realized that it would cause restless nights sometimes. It might cause losing a job. It will cause suffering and sacrifice. It might even cause physical death for some. But if physical death is the price that some must pay to free their children from a permanent life of psychological death, then nothing can be more Christian. Keep going today. Keep moving amidst every obstacle. Keep moving in every mountain of opposition. If you would do that with dignity, when the history books are written in the future, the historians would have to look back and say, there lived the great people. A people with fleecy locks and black complexion, but a people who injected new meaning into the veins of civilization, a people who stood up with dignity, stood up with honor, and saved the Western civilization in her darkest hour, a people who gave new integrity and the new dimension of love to our civilization. The morning stars will sing together, and the sons of God will shout for joy.
The power of nonviolence. From the very beginning, there was a philosophy undergirding the Montgomery boycott, the philosophy of nonviolence resistance. There was always the problem of getting this method over because it didn't make sense to most of the people in the beginning. We had to use our mass meetings to explain nonviolence to a community of people who had never heard of the philosophy and in many instances were not sympathetic with it. We had meetings twice a week on Mondays and on Thursdays, and we had an Institute of Nonviolence and Social Change. We had to make it clear that nonviolence resistance is not a method of cowardice. It does resist. It is not a method of stagnant, passive, and denying complacency. The nonviolent resistor is just as opposed to the evil that is standing against us as the violent resistor, but it resists without violence. This method is non-aggressive, physically, but strongly aggressive spiritually. Another thing we had to get over was the fact that the nonviolent resistor does not seek to humiliate or defeat the opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding. This was always a cry that we had to set before people, that our aim is not to defeat the white community, not to humiliate the white community, but to win the friendship of all the persons who had pre-partnered this system in the past. The end of violence, or the aftermath of violence, is bitterness. The aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation and the creation of a beloved community. A boycott is never an end within itself. It is merely a means to awaken a sense of shame within the oppressor, but the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. Then we had to make it clear also that the nonviolent resistor seeks to attack the evil system rather than individuals who happen to be caught up in the system. And this is why I say from this time to time that the struggle in the South is not so much the tension between white people and Negro people. The struggle is rather between justice and injustice, between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And if there is a victory, it will not be a victory merely for 50,000 Negroes, but it will be a victory for justice, a victory for goodwill, a victory for democracy. Another basic thing we had to get over is that nonviolent resistance is also an internal matter. It not only avoids external violence or external physical violence, but also internal violence of spirit. And so at the center of our momentum stood the philosophy of love, the attitude that the only way to ultimately change humanity and make for the society that we all long for is to keep love at the center of our lives. Now, people used to ask me from the beginning, what do you mean by love? And how is it that you can tell us to love those persons who seek to defeat us and those persons who stand against us? How can you love such persons? And I had to make it clear all along that love, in its highest sense, is not a sentimental sort of thing, not even an affectionate sort of thing. The Greek language uses three words for love. It talks about eros. Eros is a sort of aesthetic love. It has come to us to be a sort of romantic love, and it stands with all of us its beauty. But when we speak of love, those who oppose us, we're not talking about eros. The Greek language talks about philia, and this is a sort of reciprocal love between personal friends. This is a vital, valuable love. But when we talk of loving those who oppose you and those who seek to defeat you, we are not talking about eros or philia. The Greek language comes out with another word, and it is agape. Agape is understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all men. Biblical theologians would say it is the love of God working in the minds of men. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. And when you come to love on this level, you begin to love men not because they are likable, not because they do things to attract us, but because God loves them. And here we love the person who does the evil deed while hating the deed that the person does. It is the type of love that stands at the center of the movement that we are trying to carry on in the Southland. I am quite aware of the fact that there are persons who believe firmly in nonviolence who do not believe in a personal God. But I think every person who believes in nonviolence resistance believes somehow that the universe in some form is on the side of justice. That there is something unfolding in the universe, whether one speaks of it as an unconscious process, or whether one speaks of it as some unmoved mover, or whether someone speaks of it as a personal God. There is something in the universe that unfolds for justice. And so in Montgomery, we felt somehow that as we struggled, we had cosmic companionship. And this was one of the things that kept the people together, the belief that the universe is on the side of justice. God grant that as men and women all over the world struggle against evil systems, they will struggle with love in their hearts, with understanding good will. Agape says you must go on with the wise restraint and calm reasonableness, but you must keep moving. We have a great opportunity in America to build here a great nation, a nation where all men live together as brothers and respect the dignity and worth of all human personalities. We must keep moving toward that goal. I know that some people are saying we must slow up. There are writing letters to the North, and they are appealing to white people of goodwill and to the Negroes saying, slow up, you're pushing too fast. They are saying we must adopt a policy of moderation. Now, if moderation means moving on with wise restraint and calm reasonableness, then moderation is a great virtue that all men of goodwill must seek to achieve in this tense period of transition. But if moderation means slowing up in the move for justice and capitulating to the whims and caprices of guardians of the deadening status quo, then moderation is a tragic vice which all men of good must condemn. We must continue to move on. Our self respect is at stake. The prejudice of our nation is at stake. Civil rights is an eternal moral issue which may well determine the destiny of our civilization in the ideological struggle with communionism. We must keep moving with the wise restraint and love and with proper discipline and dignity. Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word. It is the word maladjusted. Now, we all should seek to live a well adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But there are some things within our social order to which I am proud to be maladjusted and to which I call upon you to be maladjusted. I never intended to adjust myself to segregation and discrimination. I never intended to adjust myself to mob rule. I never intended to adjust myself to the tragic efforts of the methods of physical violence and to tragic militarism. I call upon you to be maladjusted to such things. I call upon you to be maladjusted to Amos, who in the midst of injustice of his day cried out in the words that echoed across the generation, "Let judgment run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." As maladjusted as Abraham Lincoln, who the vision to see that this nation could not exist half slave and half free. As maladjusted as Jefferson, who in the midst of an age amazingly adjusted to slavery could cry out, "All men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." As maladjusted as Jesus of Nazareth, who dreamed a dream of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. God grant that we'll be so maladjusted that we will be able to go out and change our world and our civilization. And then we will be able to move from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man to the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice.
The case against tokenism. A few weeks ago, I was convicted in the city court of Albany, Georgia, for participating in a peaceful march protesting segregated conditions in that community. I decided on the basis of conscience not to pay the fine of $178, but to serve this jail sentence of 45 days. Just as I was about to get adjusted to my new home, Reverend Ralph D. Abernathy and I were notified that some unknown donor had paid our fines, that we had to leave the jail. As the Atlanta Constitution suggested shortly after, we have now reached a new landmark in race relations. We have witnessed persons being ejected from lunch counters during the sit-ins and thrown into jails during the freedom rides. But for the first time, we witnessed persons being kicked out of a jail. Victor Hugo once said that there is nothing more powerful in all the world than an idea whose time has come. Anyone sensitive to the present moods, morals, and trends in our nation must know that the time for racial justice has indeed come. The issue is not whether segregation and discrimination will be eliminated, but how they will pass the test from the scene. During the past decade, some intelligent leaders in the South have recognized inevitability. Others, however, have tried vainly to stop the wind from blowing and the tides from flowing. The recalcitrant forces authored concepts like nullification and interposition, along with such uglier evils as bombings, mob violence, and economic reprisals. But the idea whose time had come has moved on. Over the rubble left by the violence of mobsters, many communities resumed their normal activities on a new basis of partial integration. These changes have been unevenly distributed and in some communities may be barely perceptible. Yet enough has been accomplished to make the pattern of the future sharply clear. The illusions of the diehards have been shattered, and in most instances, they have made a hurried retreat from the reckless notions of ending public education and closing parks, lunch counters, and other public facilities. But in the tradition of old guards who would rather die, surrender, a new and hastily constructed roadblock has appeared in the form of planned and institutionalized tokenism. Many areas of the South are retreating to a position where they will permit a handful of Negroes to attend all-white schools or allow the employment in lily white factories of one Negro to 1,000 whites. Thus, we have advanced in some places from all-out unrestrained resistance to a sophisticated form of delaying tactics embodied in tokenism. In a sense, this is one of the most difficult problems that the integration movement confronts. But I am confident that the stratagem will prove as fruitless as the earlier attempt to mobilize massive resistance to even scintilla of change. What of the future? Will it be marked by the same actions as in the past? This is not easier to answer with precision. Certainly there will still be resistance. But I am convinced the old South has gone never to return. Many of the problems today are due to a futile attempt by the white South to maintain a system of human values that came into being under a feudalistic plantation system that cannot survive in a demonic age. If the South is to grow economically, it must continue to industrialize. Day after day, the South is receiving new multi-million-dollar industries, and with the growth of urban society, the folkways of white supremacy will gradually pass away. The arrival of industry will increase the purchasing power of the Negro, and with that will come improved medical care, greater educational opportunities, and more adequate housing. And every such development will result in a further weakening of segregation. In spite of screams of "over my dead body will any change come," the changes that have come to the South as a result of federal action must not be overlooked. There are always those who will argue that legislation, court orders, and executive decrees from the federal government are ineffective because they cannot change the heart. They contend that you cannot legislate morals. But while it may be true that Morality cannot be legislated. Behavior can be regulated. The law may not change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It will take education and religion to change bad internal attitudes, but legislation and court orders can control external effects. Federal court decrees have, for example, altered transportation patterns and changed educational mores so that the habits, if not the hearts of people, are being altered every day by federal action. And these major social changes have a cumulative force conditioning other segments of life. More and more, the voice of the church is being heard. Although it is still true that the church is the most segregated major institution in the United States of America. As a minister of the gospel, I am ashamed to say that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, when we stand to sing, "In Christ there is no east nor west," churches are courageously making attacks on segregation and even integrating their congregations. Several parochial and church-related schools of the South are also throwing off the incubus. And as the church continues to take a forthright stand on this issue, the transition from a segregated to an integrated society will infinitely and indefinitely smoother. Probably the most powerful force, however, in breaking down the barriers of segregation is the new determination of the Negro himself. For many years, the Negro tactically accepted them. He was often a victim of stagnant passivity and deadening complacency. While there were always lone voices in the Negro community crying out for segregation, conditions of fear and apathy made it difficult for them to develop into a mass chorus. But through the forces of history, something happened to the Negro. The social upheavals of 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the spread of the automobile made it possible and necessary for the Negro to move away from his former isolation on the rural plantation. The deadline of agriculture and the parallel growth of industry have drawn large crowds of Negroes to urban centers and brought about a gradual improvement in their economic status. New contracts have led to a broadening outlook and new possibilities for educational advancement. Once plagued with a tragic sense of inferiority resulting from the crippling effects of slavery and segregation, the Negro has now been driven to reevaluate himself. He has come to feel that he is somebody. And with this new case of somebodyness and self-respect, a new Negro has emerged with a new determination to achieve freedom and human dignity, whatever the cost may be. This is the true meaning of the struggle that is taking place in the South today. One cannot understand the Montgomery bus boycott, the sit-ins, and the Albany, Georgia movement without understanding that there is a new Negro on the scene with a new sense of dignity and destiny. Thousands of Negroes have come to see that it is ultimately more honorable to suffer indignity than accept segregation in humiliation. A special feature of our struggle is its universal quality. Every social stratum is involved, lower, middle, and upper class, and every age, children, teenagers, adults, and senior citizens. The whole nation was startled by the Montgomery bus protest in 1956, chiefly because every Negro allied himself with the cause in firm discipline. The same universal involvement is now appearing in Albany, Georgia. Last December, more than 700 Negroes from the community willingly went to jail to create an effective protest. I shall never forget the experience of seeing women over 70, teenagers and middle-aged adults crowding the cells, some with professional degrees in medicine, law, and education, some simple housekeepers and laborers, and others from business. All were different in age and social status, but all were unified in one objective. Negro solidarity is a powerful growing force which no society may wisely ignore. Fortunately, the Negro has been willing to create this powerful force in his struggle for racial justice, namely nonviolent resistance. This is not meant as a substitute for litigation and legislation, which must continue. But those who adhere to the method of nonviolent direct action recognize that legislation and court orders tend only to declare rights. They can never thoroughly deliver them. It's only when the people themselves begin to act are rights on paper given lifeblood. Life is breathed into a judicial decision by the persistent exercise of legal rights until they become usual and ordinary in human experience. These methods of nonviolent resistance, they are effective in that way of disarming opponents. It exposes their moral defenses, weakens their moral, and at the same time works on their conscience. It makes it possible for the individual to struggle for moral ends through moral means. One of the most persistent philosophical debates throughout the centuries has been over the question of ends and means. There have been those like Machiavelli who have argued that the end justifies the means. This, I feel, is one of the greatest tragedies of the community. Read Lenin, as he says, lying, deceit, and violence are justifiable means to bring about the aim of a classless society. This is where the principle of nonviolence breaks with communism and any other method which holds to the same belief. In a real sense, the means represent the ideal in the making, the end in process. So, in the long run, destructive means cannot bring about constructive ends because the ends are pre-existent in the means. Nonviolent resistance also provides a creative force through which men can channelize their discontent. It does not require that they abandon it, for this kind of discontent is sound and healthy. Nonviolence simply saves it from degenerating into morbid bitterness and hatred. Hate is always tragic. It is injurious to the hater as it is to the hated. It distorts the personality and scars the soul. Psychiatrists believing that many of man's inner conflicts are rooted in hate, are now saying, love or perish. And this is the beauty of nonviolence. It says you can struggle without hating. It says you can fight this war without violence. It is my great hope that as the Negro plunges deeper into the quest for freedom, he will plunge even deeper into the philosophy of nonviolence. And as a race, Negroes must passionately and unrelentingly for first-class citizenship, but they must never use second-class methods to gain it. They must never succumb to the temptation of using violence in the struggle. I feel that this way of nonviolence is vital because it is the only way to reestablish the broken community. It is the method which seeks the implementation of just law by appealing to the conscience of the great decent majority who through blindness, fear, pride, or irrationality have allowed their conscience to sleep. The non-violent resistors can summarize their message in the following simple terms. We will take direct action against injustice without waiting for other agencies to act. We will not obey unjust laws or submit to unjust practices. We will do this peacefully, openly, cheerfully, because our aim is to persuade. We adopt the means of nonviolence because our end is a community at peace itself. We will try to persuade with our words, but if our words fail, we will try to persuade with our acts. We will always be willing to talk and seek fair compromise, but we are ready to suffer when necessary and even risk our lives to become witnesses to the truth as we see it. Along with the continued efforts in nonviolent direct action, the movement is determined to extend the exercise of neglected constitutional privileges, particularly in the exercise of the ballot. A campaign has been started to involve millions of Negroes in the use of the franchise. Negro workers have already suffered violence and arrests for these efforts, but the campaign will continue. I believe that bedside is intensified effort, an expanded federal government program of vigorous law enforcement is also indispensable. A number of administrative initiatives have already been useful, and the present Justice Department has certainly moved with forthrightness and concern in the sensitive area of voter registration. But the coming period will undoubtedly require the Justice Department to utilize the Civil Rights Act of 1960 extensively and seek court-appointed references in thousands of communities in which the right to vote is vacantly and brutally denied to Negroes. The majesty of federal law must assert its supremacy over the reign of evil dominating defiant Southern communities. And so far, I have discussed only the problem as it exists in the South. But that is not to suggest that the problem is merely Southern. No section of the country can boast of clean hands. Segregation may exist in the South in overt and glaring forms, but it also exists in the North in hidden and subtle ways. Discrimination in housing and employment is often as bad in the North as it is anywhere. The racial issue confronting America is not a sectional issue, but a national problem. Nor must anyone assume that the problem is almost solved and that people can therefore complacently by the wayside and await the coming of the inevitable. Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. The theory of evolution is valid in biology. But when Herbert Spencer seeks to apply it to the whole of society, there is little evidence to support it. The most superficial look at history shows that no social advance rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of dedicated individuals. Without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of primitive forces and social stagnation. Unnecessary delays have already been suffered in the civil rights struggle through a lack of vigorous action. And to outline the problem is to chart the course of the Negro freedom movement. A piece of freedom is no longer enough for human beings, nor for the nation of which Negroes are part. They have been given pieces, but unlike bread, a slice of liberty does not finish hunger. Freedom is like life. It cannot be had in installments. Freedom is indispensable. We all have it, or we are not free. The Negro's goal is freedom. I believe we will win it because the goal of the nation is freedom. Yet we are not passively waiting for deliverance to come from others out of pity. Our destiny is bound with the destiny of America. We built it for 2 centuries without wages. We made cotton king. We built our homes and homes for our masters and suffered injustice and humiliation. But out of the bottomless vitality, we continue to live and grow. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not extinguish our existence, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We feel that we are the conscience of America. We are its troubled soul. We will continue to insist that right be done because both God's will and the heritage of our nation speak through our echoing demands.
The power of nonviolence. From the very beginning, there was a philosophy undergirding the Montgomery boycott, the philosophy of nonviolent resistance. There was always the problem of getting this method over because it didn't make sense to most of the people in the beginning. We had to use our mass meetings to explain nonviolence to a community of people who had never heard the philosophy, and in many instances were not sympathetic with it. We had meetings twice a week on Mondays and on Thursdays, and we had an institute on nonviolence and social change. We had to make it clear that nonviolent resistance is not a method of cowardice. It does resist. It is not a method of stagnant passivity and demeaning complacency. The nonviolent resistor is just as opposed to the evil that he is standing against as the violent resistor. but he resists without violence. This method is non-aggressive physically, but strongly aggressive spiritually. Not to humiliate, but to win over. Another thing that we had to get over was the fact that the nonviolent resistor does not seek to humiliate or defeat the opportunity, but to win his friendship and his understanding. This was always a cry. We had to set before people that our aim is not to defeat the white community, not to humiliate the white community, but to win the friendship of all the persons who had penetrated this system in the past. The end of violence or the aftermath of violence is bitterness. The aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation and the creation of a beloved community. A boycott is never an end within itself. It is merely a means to awaken a sense of shame within the oppressor. But the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. Then we had to make clear that the nonviolent resistance seeks to attack the evil system, rather that individual who happens to be caught up in the system. And this is why I say from time to time that the single most prevalent thing in the South is not so much the tension between the white people and Negro people. The struggle is rather between justice and injustice, between the force of light and the forces of darkness. And if there is a victory, it will not be a victory merely for 50,000 Negroes, but it will be a victory for justice, a victory for goodwill, a victory for democracy. Another basic thing we had to get over is that nonviolence resistance is also an internal matter. It's not only a place to avoid external violence and external physical violence, but also internal violence, violence in spirit. And so the center of our movement stood the philosophy of love. And so at the center of our movement stood the philosophy of love, the attitude that the only way to ultimately change humanity and make for the society, and how it is that you can tell us to love those persons who seek to defeat us and those persons who stand against us. How can you love such persons? And I had to make it clear all along that love in its highest sense is not a sentimental sort of thing, not even an affectionate sort of thing. The Greek language urges 3 words for love. It talks about eros. Eros is a sort of aesthetic love. It has come to us to be a sort of romantic love and stands with all of its beauty. But when we speak of loving those who oppose us, we're not talking about eros. The Greek language talks about philia, and this is a sort of reciprocal love between personal friends. This is a vital, valuable love. But when we talk of loving those who oppose you and those who seek to defeat you, we are not talking about eros or philia. The Greek language comes out with another word, and it is agape. Agape is understanding, creative, redemptive, goodwill for all men. Biblical theologians would say it is the love of God working in the minds of men. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. And when you come to love on this level, you begin to love men in return. And when you come to love on this level, you become to love men because they are likable, not because they do things that attract, but because God moves them. And here we love the person who does the evil deed while hating the deed that the person does. It is the type of love that stands at the center of the movement that we are trying to carry on in the Southland. Agape, some power in the universe that works justice. I'm quite aware of the fact that there are persons who believe firmly in nonviolence, who do not believe in a personal God. But I think every person who believes in nonviolent resistance believes somehow that the universe in some form is on the side of justice, that there is something unfolding in the universe. Rather, one speaks of it as an unconscious process, or rather, one speaks of it as if it is an unmoved mover, or rather, one speaks of it as a personal God. There's something in the universe that unfolds for justice. And so in Montgomery, we felt somehow that as we struggled, we had cosmic companionship. And this was one of the things that kept the people together, the belief that the universe is on the side of justice. God grant that as men and women all over the world struggle against evil systems, they will struggle with love in their hearts, with understanding goodwill. Agape says you must go on with wise restraint and calm, reasonable, but you must keep moving. We have a great opportunity in America to build here a great nation, a nation all men live together as brothers and respect the dignity and worth of all human personality. We must keep moving toward the goal. I know that some people are saying we must slow up. They're writing letters to the North and they are appealing to white people of goodwill and to the Negroes saying, slow up your pushing. You're pushing too fast. They're saying we adopt a policy of moderation. Now, if moderation is fast, they are saying we must adopt that policy. Now, if moderation means moving on and wise, restraint, and calm reasonableness, then moderation is a great virtue that all men of goodwill must seek to achieve in this tense period of translation. But if moderation means slowing up in the movement for justice and capitulating to the whims and caprices of the guardians of the treading status quo, to the whims of the caprices of the guardians of the deadening status quo, then moderation is a tragic vice which all men of goodwill must condemn. We must continue to move on. Our self-respect is at stake. The prestige of our nation is at stake. Civil rights is an external moral issue which may well determine the destiny of our civilization. The ideological struggle with communism. We must keep moving with wise restraint and love and with proper discipline and dignity. the need to be maladjusted. Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word. It is the word maladjusted. Now, we all should seek to live a well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But there are some things within our social order to which I am proud to be maladjusted, and to which I call upon you to be maladjusted. Never intended to adjust, or I never intend to adjust myself to segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to mob rule. I never intend to address myself to the totalitarianism. I call upon you to be maladjusted to such things. I call upon you to be as maladjusted as Amos, who in the midst of the injustices of the day cried out in words that echoed across the generation. Let judgment run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. As maladjusted as Abraham Lincoln, who had the vision to see that this nation could not exist half slave and half free. As maladjusted as Jefferson, who in the midst of an age of amazing adjusted to slavery, cry out, all men are created equal and are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As maladjusted as Jews of Nazareth, who dreamed a dream of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. God grant that we will be so maladjusted that we will be able to go out and change our world and our civilization. And then we will be able to move from the bleak and desolated midnight of man's humanity to man, the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and of justice.
The most durable power. Always be sure that you struggle with Christian methods and Christian weapons. Never succumb to the temptation of becoming bitter. As you press on for justice, be sure to move with dignity and discipline, using only the weapon of love. Let no man pull you so low as to hate him. Always avoid violence. If you succumb to the temptation of using violence in your struggle, unborn generations will be the recipients of a long and desolate night of bitterness. And your chief legacy to the future will be an endless reign of a meaningless chaos. In your struggle for justice, let your oppressor know that you are not attempting to defeat or humiliate him, or even to pay him back for the injustices that he has heaped upon you. But let him know that you are merely seeking justice for him as well as for yourself. Let him know that the festering sore of segregation debilitates the white man as well as the Negro. With this attitude, you will be able to keep your struggle on high Christian standards. many persons will realize the urgency of seeking to eradicate the evils of segregation. There will be many Negroes who will devote their lives to the cause for freedom. There will be many white persons of goodwill and strong moral sensitivity who will dare to take a stand for justice. Honesty impels me to admit that such a stand will require a willingness to suffer and to sacrifice. So don't despair if you are condemned and persecuted for righteousness' sake. Whenever you stand for truth and justice, you are liable to scorn. Often, you will be called an impractical idealist or a dangerous radical. Sometimes it might mean going to jail. If such is the case, you might honorably grace the jail with your presence. It might even mean physical death. But if physical death is the price that some must pay to free their children from a permanent life of psychological death, then nothing could be more Christian. I still believe that standing up for the truth of God is the greatest thing in the world. This is the end of life. The end of life is not to be happy. The end of life is not to achieve pleasure and avoid pain. The end of life is to do the will of God, come what may. I still believe that love is the most durable power in the world. And over the centuries, men have sought to discover the highest good. This has been the chief quest of ethical philosophy. This was one of the big questions of Greek philosophy. The Epicureans and the Stoics sought to answer it. Plato and Aristotle sought to answer it. What is summum bonum of life? I think I have discovered the highest good. It is love. This principle stands at the center of the cosmos. And as John says, God is love. He who loves is a participant in the being of God. He who hates does not know God.
Suffering and faith. Some of my personal sufferings over the last few years have also served to shape my thinking. I always hesitate to mention these experiences for fear of conveying the wrong impression. A person who constantly calls attention to his trials and sufferings is in danger of developing a martyr complex and of making others feel that he is consciously seeking sympathy. It is impossible for one to be self-centered in his self-denial and self-righteous in his self-sacrifice. So I am always reluctant to refer my personal sacrifices. But I feel somewhat justified in mentioning them in this article because of the influence they have had in shaping my thinking. Due to my involvement in the struggle for the freedom of my people, I have known very few quiet days in the last few years. I have been arrested 5 times and put in Alabama jails. My home has been bombed twice. A day seldomly passes that my family and I are not the recipients of threats of death. I have been the victim of a near-fatal stabbing. So in a real sense, I have been battered by the storms of persecution. I must admit that at times I felt that I could no longer bear such a heavy burden. and have been tempted to retreat to a more quiet and sincere life. But every time such a temptation appeared, something came to strengthen and sustain my determination. I have learned now that the master's burden is lightly precisely when we take his yoke upon us. My personal trials have also taught me the value of unmerited suffering. As my suffering mounted, I soon realized that there were two ways that I could respond to my situation: either to react with bitterness or seek to transform the suffering into a creative force. I decided to follow the latter course. Recognizing the necessity for suffering, I have tried to make it a virtue. If only to save myself from bitterness, I have attempted to see my personal ordeals as an opportunity to transform myself and heal the people involved in the tragic situation which now obtains. I have lived these last few years with the conviction that unearned suffering is redemptive. There are some who will still find the cross a stumbling block, and others consider it foolish. But I am more convinced than ever before that is the power of God unto social and individual salvation. So, like the Apostle Paul, I can now humbly yet proudly say, I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. The suffering and agonizing moments through which I have passed over the last few years have also drawn me closer to God. More than ever before, I am convinced of the reality of a personal God.
The burning truth in the South. An electrifying movement of Negro students has shattered the placid surface of campuses and communities across the South. Though confronted in many places by hoodlum police, guns, tear gas, arrest, and jail sentences, the students tenaciously continue to sit down and demand equal service at the variety store lunch counters and extend their protests from city to city. In communities like Montgomery, Alabama, the whole student body rallied between the expelled students and staged a walkout while state government intimidation was unleashed with a display of military force appropriate for a wartime invasion. Nevertheless, the spirit of self-sacrifice and commitment remains firm, and the state governments find themselves dealing with students who have lost the fear of jail and physical injury. It is no overstatement to characterize these events as historic. Never before in the United States had so large a body of students spread a struggle over so great an area in pursuit of a goal of human dignity and freedom. The southernness which this development burst upon the nation has given rise to the description spontaneous. Yet it is not without clearly perceivable causes and precedents. First, we should go back to the ending of World War II. Then the new will and determination of the Negro was irrevocably generated. Hundreds of thousands of young Negro men were mustered out of the armed forces, and with their honorable discharge papers and the GI Bill of Rights grants, they received the promise from a grateful nation that the broader democracy for which they had fought would begin to assume reality. They believed in this promise and acted in the conviction that changes were guaranteed. Some changes did appear, but commensurate neither with the promise nor the need. Struggles of a local character began to emerge, but the scope and results were limited. Few Americans outside the immediately affected areas even realized a struggle was taking place. One perceptible aspect was the steady, significant increase in voting registration, which took place, symbolizing the determination of the Negro, particularly the veteran, to make his rights a reality. The number of registered voters reached a point higher than exists today. The United States Supreme Court decision of 1954 was viewed by Negroes as the delivery of the part of promise of change. In unequivocal language, the court affirmed that separate but equal facilities are inherently unequal, and that to segregate a child on the basis of his race is to deny that child equal protection of the law. This decision brought hope to millions of disinherited Negroes who had formerly dared only to dream of freedom. But the implementation of the decision was not to be realized without a sharp and difficult struggle. Through 5 years of turmoil, some advances were achieved. The victory is far from complete, but the determination by Negroes that it will be won is universal. What relation have these events to the students sitting in? It was the young veteran who gave the first surge of power to the post-war civil rights movement. It was the high school, college, and elementary school young people who were in the front line of the school desegregation struggle. Lest it be forgotten, the opening of hundreds of schools to Negroes for the first time in history required that there be young Negroes with the moral and physical courage to face the challenges and all too frequently the mortal danger presented by mob resistance. There were such young Negroes in the tens of thousands, and no program for integration failed for wants of students. The simple courage of students and their parents should never be forgotten. In the years of 1958 and 1959, two massive youth marches to Washington for integrated schools involved 40,000 young people who brought with them nearly 500,000 signatures on petitions gathered largely from campuses and youth centers. This mass action infused a new spirit of direct action, challenging government to act forthrightly. And hence for a decade, young Negroes have been steeled by both deeds and inspiration to step into responsible action. These are the precedents for the student struggle of today. Many related interacting social forces must be understood if we are to understand history as it is being made. The arresting upsurge of Africa and Asia is remote neither in time nor in space to the Negro of the South. Indeed, the determination of Negro Americans to win freedom from all forms of oppression springs from the same deep longing that motivates oppressed peoples all over the world. However inadequate forms of education and communication may be, the ordinary Negro, Jim Smith, knows that in primitive jungle villages in India, still illiterate peasants are casting a free ballot for their state and federal legislators. And one after another of the new African states, black men formed the government, write the laws, and administer the affairs of the state. But in state after state in the United States, the Negro is ruled and governed without a fragment of participation in civic life. The contrast is burning truth, which has molded a deep determination to end this intolerable condition. Negroes have also experienced sharp frustration as they struggle for the realization of promises expressed in hollow legislative enactments or empty electoral campaign oratory. conferences from the lowest level of officialdom up to the chief executive in the White House result in the clarification of problems, but not their solution. Studies by many commissions, unhappily devoid of power, continue to pose problems without any concrete results that could be translated into jobs, education, equality of opportunity, and access to the fruits of a historic period of prosperity. In the affluent society of the Negro has remained the poor, the underprivileged, and the lowest class. Court actions are often surrounded by a special type of red tape that is made for long drawn-out processes of litigation and evasive schemes. The Negro has also become aware that token integration was not a start in good faith, but a new form of discrimination covered up with certain niceties. It was inevitable, therefore, that a more direct approach would be sought, one which would contain the promise of some immediate degree of success based upon the concrete act of the Negro. Hence, a period began in which the emphasis shifted from the slow court process to direct action in the form of bus protests, economic boycotts, mass marches to and demonstrations in the nation capital and state capitals. One may wonder why the present movement started with the lunch counter. The answer lies in the fact that here the Negro has suffered indignities and injustices that cannot be justified or explained. Almost every Negro has experienced the tragic inconveniences of lunch counter segregation. He cannot understand why he is welcomed with open arms at most counters in the store, but is denied service at a certain counter because it happens to be selling food and drink. In a real sense, the sit-ins represent more than a demand for service. They represent a demand for respect. It is absurd to think of this movement of being initiated by communists or some of the outside group. This movement is an expression of the longing of new Negroes for freedom and human dignity. These students were anchored to lunch counter seats by the accumulated indignities of days gone by and the boundless aspiration of generations yet unborn. And this new method of protest, a new philosophy provided a special undergirding, the philosophy of nonviolence. It was first modestly and quietly projected in one community, Montgomery, when the threat of violence became real in a bus protest, but it burst from this limited arena and was embraced by masses of people across the nation with fervor and consistency. The appeal of nonviolence has many facets. First, it proclaims the sincere and earnest wish of the Negro that though changes must be accomplished, there's no desire to use or tolerate force. This is inconsistent with the deeply religious tradition of Negroes. Second, it denies that vengeance for past oppressions motivate the new spirit of determined struggle. Third, it begins to the point of action a great multitude who need the assurance that a technique exists which is suitable and practical for a minority confronting a majority, often vicious and possessed of effective weapons of combat. Fourth, many Negroes recognize the necessity of creating discord to alter established community patterns, but they strongly desire that controls be built in so that neither they nor their adversaries would find themselves engaged in mutual destruction. Fifth, having faith that the white majority is not an undifferentiated whole, Negro leaders have welcomed a moral appeal which can reach the emotions and intellect of significant white groups. The appeal of the philosophy of nonviolence encompasses these many requirements. The key significance of the truth of the student movement lies in the fact that from its inception everywhere, it has combined direct action and nonviolence. This quality has given it the extraordinary power and discipline which every thinking person observes. It has discredited the adversary who knows how to deal with forces but is bewildered and panically in the face of new techniques. Time will reveal that the students are learning lessons not contained in their textbooks. Hundreds have already been expelled. They've been fined. They've been imprisoned. They have been brutalized, and the numbers continue to grow. But with the punishment, something more is growing. A generation of young people have come out of decades of shadows to face naked state power. It has lost its fears and experienced the majestic dignity of a direct struggle for its own liberation. These young people have connected up with their own history, the slave revolts, the incomplete revolution of the Civil War, the brotherhood of colonial colored men in Africa and Asia. They are an integral part of the history which is reshaping the world, replacing the dying order with modern democracy. They're doing this in a nation whose own birth spread new principles and shattered a medieval society that dominated most of the globe. It is extremely significant that in many places the Negro students have found white allies to join in their actions. It is equally significant that on the mass scale, students and adults in North and elsewhere have organized supporting actions, many of which are still only in their early stages. The segregationists now face some hard alternatives. They can continue to seek and maintain segregated facilities. In this event, they must live with discord of themselves, initiate and be responsible for violence with all its evil consequences. They may close the facilities as they have done in many places, but this will not end the movement. Rather, it will spread to libraries, public sparks, schools, and the like, and these two would have to be closed, thus depriving both white and Negro of necessary culture and recreational institution. This would be a step backwards for the whole society. Well, finally, they can accept the principle of equality. In this case, they still have two alternative approaches. They may make the facilities equally bad for both white and Negro, or equally good. Thus, finally, simple logic and justice in their own interest should direct them to the only acceptable solution: to accept equality and maintain it on the best level for both races. The outcome of the present struggle will be some time in unfolding, but the line of this direction is clear. It is a final refutation of the time-honored theory that the Negro prefers segregation. It would be futile to deplore, as many do, the tensions accompanying the social changes. Tension and conflict are not alien nor abnormal to growth, but as the natural results of the process of changes. A revolution is occurring in both the social order and the human mind. 184 years ago, a bold group of men signed the Declaration of Independence. If their struggle had been lost, they had signed their own death warrant. And nevertheless, though explicitly regretting that King George had forced them to their extreme by a long train of abuses, they resolutely acted, and a great new society was born. The Negro students, their parents, and their allies are acting today in that imperishable tradition.
the current crisis in race relations. In American life, there is today a real crisis in race relations. This crisis has been precipitated, on the one hand, by the determined resistance of reactionary elements of the South to the Supreme Court's momentous decision against segregation in public schools. Many states have risen in open defiance. Legislative halls of the South ring loud with such words of interposition and nullification. The Ku Klux Klan is on the march again, determined to preserve segregation at any cost. Then there is the white citizens' councils. All these forces have conjoined to make our massive resistance. The crisis has been precipitated, on the other hand, by the radical change in the Negro's evolution of himself. There would probably be no crisis in race relations if the Negro continued to think of himself in inferior terms and patiently accepted the injustices and exploitation. But it is at this very point that the change has come. For many years, the Negro accepted segregation. He was the victim of stagnant passivity and deadening complacency. The system of slavery and segregation caused many Negroes to feel that perhaps they were inferior. This is the ultimate tragedy of segregation. It not only harms the physical, but it injures spirituality. It scars the soul and distorts the personality. It inflicts the segregator with a false sense of superiority, while inflicting the segregated with a false sense of inferiority. But through the forces of history, something happened to the Negro. He came to feel that he was somebody. He came to feel that the important things about a man is not the color of his skin or the texture of his hair, but the texture and quality of his soul. With this new sense of dignity and self-respect, a new Negro emerged. So there has been a revolutionary change in Negro's evolution and elevation and evaluation of his natural and his nature and his destiny, and a determination to achieve freedom and human dignity. This determination springs from the same longing for freedom that motivates oppressed people all over the world. The deep rumblings of discontent from Asia and Africa are bottom. A quest for freedom and human dignity on the part of the people who have long been the victims of colonialism and imperialism. The struggle for freedom on the part of oppressed people in general, and the American Negro in particular, is not suddenly going to disappear. It is so sociologically true that privileged classes rarely ever give up their privileges without strong resistance. It is also true that once oppressed people rise up against their oppression, there is no stopping points short of full freedom. So realism impels us to admit that the struggle will continue until freedom is a reality for all of the oppressed people of the world. Since the struggle will continue, the basic question which confronts the oppressed peoples of the world is this: how will the struggle against the forces of injustice be waged? There are two possible answers. One is to resort to the all-prevalent method of physical violence and corroding hatred. Violence, nevertheless, solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. Occasionally, violence is temporarily successful, but never permanently so. It often brings temporary victory, but never permanent peace. If the American Negro and other victims of oppression succumb to the temptations of using violence in the struggle for justice, unborn generations will be the recipients of a long and desolate night of bitterness, and their chief legacy to the future will be an endless reign of meaningless chaos. The alternative to violence is the method of nonviolence resistance. This method is nothing more and nothing less than our Christianity in action. It is human relations. This method was made famous in our generations by Gandhi, who used it to free his country from the denomination of the British Empire. This method has also been used in Montgomery under the leadership of the ministers of all denominations to free 50,000 Negroes from the long night on a bus. Several basic things can be said about nonviolence as a method in bringing about better racial conditions. First, this is not a method of cowardice or stagnant passivity. It does resist. The nonviolence resistor is as opposed to evil against which he is protesting as the person who used violence. It is true that this method is passive or aggressive in the sense of the nonviolent resistor. It is not aggressively physically or toward its opponent, but his mind and emotions, and almost active, constantly seeking to pursue the opponent that he is mistaken. This method is passive physically, but is strongly actively spiritually. It is non-aggressively physically, but dynamically aggressive spirituality. A second basic fact about this method is that it does not seek to defeat or to humiliate the opponent, but to win his friendship and his understanding. The non-violent resistor must open voice his protests through non-cooperation or boycotts. But he realizes that non-cooperation and boycotts are not ends in themselves. They are means to awaken a sense of moral shame within the opponent. The end is redemption and reconciliation. The aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community, while the aftermath of violence is tragic bitterness. A third fact that characterizes the method of nonviolence is that the attack is directed to the forces of evil, rather than persons caught in the forces. It is evil that we are seeking to defeat, not the persons victimized with evil. Those of us who struggle against racial injustice must come to see that the basic tension is not between races. As I like to say to the people in Montgomery, Alabama, the tension in this city is not between white people and Negro people. The tension is the bottom between justice and injustice, between forces of light and the forces of darkness. And if there is victory, it will be a victory, not merely for 50,000 Negroes, but a victory for justice and the forces of life. We are out to defeat injustice and not the white persons who may happen to be unjust. A fourth point that must be brought out concerning the method of nonviolence is that this method not only avoids external and physical violence, but also internal violence of spirit. At the center of nonviolence stands the principles of love. In struggling for human dignity, the oppressed people of the world must not succumb to the temptation or become bitter of indulging in hate campaigns. To retaliate with hate and bitterness would do nothing but intensify the existence of hate in our world. We have learned through the grim realities of life and history that hate and violence solve nothing. They only serve to push us deeper and deeper into the mire. Violence begets violence, hate begets hate, and toughness begets a greater toughness. It is all a descending spiral, and the end is destruction for everybody. Along the way of life, someone must have enough sense and morality to cut off the chain of hate by projecting the ethics of love into the center of our lives. In speaking of love, I'm not referring to some sentimental and affectionate emotion. It would be nonsense to urge men to love their oppressors in an affectionate sense. Love in this connection means understanding, goodwill, as expressed in the Greek word agape. This means nothing sentimental or basically affectionate. It means understanding, redeeming goodwill for all men, and ever-owing love which seeks nothing in return. It is spontaneous, unmotivated, groundless, and creative. It is the love of God operating in the human heart. When we rise to love on the agape level, we rise to the position of loving the person who does the evil deed while hating the deed that the person does. A fifth basic fact about the method of nonviolent resistance is that it is based on the conviction that the universe is on the side of justice. It is this deep faith in the future that causes the nonviolent resistor to accept suffering without retaliation. He knows that in his struggle for justice, he has a cosmic companionship. Now I am aware of the fact that there are devoted believers in nonviolence who find it difficult to believe in a personal God. But even these persons believe in the existence of some creative force that works for togetherness, a creative force in the universe that works to bring the disconnected aspects of reality into a harmonious whole. There is a creative power in the universe that works to bring low gigantic mountains of evil and pull down prodigious hilltops of injustice. This is the faith that keeps the nonviolent resistor going through all of the tensions and sufferings that he must inevitably confront. Those of us who call the names of Jesus Christ find something at the center of our faith which forever reminds us that God is on the side of truth and justice. Good Friday may occupy the throne for a day, but ultimately it must give way to the triumph of Easter. Evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy a palace and Christ a cross. But that same Christ arose and split history into AD and BC, so that even the life of Caesar must be dated by his name. Yes, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. There's something in this universe which justifies William Cullen Bryant saying, "Truth crushed to earth will rise again." So in Montgomery, Alabama, we can walk and never get weary because we know that there will be a great camp meeting in the promised land of freedom and injustice. I cannot close this article without saying that the problem of race is indeed America's greatest moral dilemma. The churches are called upon to recognize the urgent necessity of taking a forthright stand on this critical and crucial issue. If we are to remain true to the gospel of Jesus Christ, we cannot rest until segregation and discrimination are banished from every area of American life. Many churches have already taken a stand. The National Council of Churches has condemned segregation over and over and over again and has requested its constituent denominations to do likewise. Most of the major denominations have endorsed that action. Many individual members and ministers in the South have stood up with dauntless courage. High tribute and appreciation is due the 90 ministers of Atlanta, Georgia, who so courageously signed a noble statement calling for compliance with the law and a reopening of the channels of communication between the races. All of these things are admirable and deserve our highest praise. But we must admit that these courageous stands from the church are still far too few. The sublime statements of the major denominations on the question of human relations move all too slowly to the local churches in actual practice. All too many ministers are still silent. It may well be that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition is not the glaring noisiness of the so-called bad people, but the appalling silence of the so-called good people. It may be that our generation will have to repent, not only for the diabolical actions and the fanatical words of the children of darkness, but also for the crippling fears and tragic apathy of the children of light. What we need is a restless determination to have a determination to make the ideal brotherhood a reality in this nation and all over the world. There are certain technical words which tend to become stereotypes and cliches after a certain period of time. Psychologists have a word which is probably used more frequently than any other word in the modern psychology. It is the word maladjusted. In a sense, all of us must live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But there are some things in our social system to which all of us ought to be maladjusted. I never intended to adjust myself to the viciousness of a Rob and Marv rule. I never intended to adjust myself to the evils of segregation and the crippling effects of discrimination. I never intended to adjust myself to the inequalities of an economic system which takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. I never intended to become adjusted to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating method of physical violence. It may be that the salvation of the world lies in the hands of the maladjusted. The challenge to us is to be maladjusted. As maladjusted as the prophet Amos, who in the midst of the injustices of his day could cry out in words that echo across the centuries, and down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. As maladjusted as Lincoln, who had the vision to see that this nation could not survive half slave and half free, as maladjusted as Jefferson, who in the midst of an age amazingly adjusted to slavery, could cry out in words uplifted in cosmic proportions. All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as maladjusted as Jesus, who could say to the men and women of his generation, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you. The world is in a desperate need of maladjustment. Through such courageous maladjustment, we will be able to emerge from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man into the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice.
Speech before the Youth March for Integrated Schools. As I stand here and look out upon the thousands of Negro faces and the thousands of white faces intermingled like the waters of a river, I see only one face, the face of the future. Yes, as I gaze upon the great historic assembly, this unprecedented gathering of young people, I cannot help thinking that 100 years from now, the historians will be calling this not the beat generation, but the generation of integration. The fact that thousands of you came here to Washington and that thousands more signed your petition proves that this generation will not take no for an answer, will not take double talk for an answer, will not take gradualism for an answer. It proves that the only answer you will settle for is total desegregation and total equality now. I know of no words eloquent enough to express the deep meaning, the great power, and the unconquerable spirit back of this inspiringly original, unequal American march of young people. Nothing like it has ever happened in the history of our nation. Nothing, that is, except the last Youth March. What this march demonstrates to me, above all else, is that you, young people, through your own experience, have somehow discovered the central fact of American life, that the extensions of democracy for all Americans depend upon complete integration of Negro Americans. By coming here, you have shown yourselves to be highly alert, highly responsible young citizens, and very soon the area of your responsibility will increase. For you will begin to exercise your greatest privilege as an American, the right to vote. Of course, you will have no difficulty exercising this privilege if you are white, but I wonder if you can understand what it feels like to be a Negro living in the South, where, by attempting to exercise this right, you may be taking your life in your hands. The denial of the vote not only deprives the Negro of his constitutional rights, but what is even worse, it degrades him as a human being. And yet, even this degradation, which is only one of many humiliations of everyday life, is losing its ability to degrade. For the Southern Negro of everyday life, for the Southern Negro is learning to transform his degradation into resistance, nonviolent resistance. And by so doing, he is not only achieving his dignity as a human being, he is helping to advance democracy in the South. This is why my colleagues and I in the Southern Leadership Conference are giving our major attention to the campaign to increase the registration of Negro voters in the South to 3 million. Do you realize what would happen in this country if we were to gain 3 million Southern Negro votes? We could change the composition of Congress. We could have a Congress far more responsive to the voters' will. We could have all schools integrated, North and South. A new era would open to all Americans. Thus, the Negro, in his struggle to secure his own rights, is destined to enlarge democracy for all people, in both a political and a social sense. Indeed, you are a great movement to organize a march for integrated schools. You have actually accomplished much more. You have awakened on hundreds of campuses throughout the land a new spirit of social inquiry to the benefits of all Americans. This is really a noble cause. As June approaches with its graduation ceremonies and speeches, a thought suggests itself. You will hear much about careers, security, and prosperity. I will leave the discussion of such matters to your deans, your principals, and your valedictorians. But I do have a graduation thought to pass along to you. Whatever career you may choose for yourself, doctor, lawyer, teacher, let me propose an avocation to be pursued along with it. Become a dedicated fighter for civil rights. Make it a central part of your life. It will make you a better doctor, better lawyer, a better teacher. It will enrich your spirit as nothing else possibly can. It will give you that rare sense of nobility that can only spring from love and selflessly helping your fellow man. Make a career of humanity. Commit yourself to the noble struggle for equal rights. You will make a greater person for yourself, a greater nation for your country, and a final world to live in.
The Nobel Prize acceptance speech. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I accept the Nobel Prize for Peace at a time when 2 million Americans of the United States are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice. I accept this award on behalf of a civil rights movement which is moving with determination and a majestic scorn for risk and a danger to establish a reign of freedom and a rule of justice. I'm mindful that only yesterday in Birmingham, Alabama, our children crying out for brotherhood were answered with fire hoses, snarling dogs, and even death. I am mindful that only yesterday in Philadelphia, Mississippi, young people seeking to secure the right to vote were brutalized and murdered. I am mindful that debilitating and grinding poverty afflicts my people and chains them to the lowest rung of the economic ladder. Therefore, I must ask, why this prize is awarded to a movement which is beleaguered and committed to unrelenting struggle, a movement which has not won the very peace and brotherhood which is the essence of the Nobel Prize. After contemplation, I conclude that this award which I receive on behalf of that movement is a profound recognition that nonviolence is the answer to crucial political and moral question of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to violence and oppression. Civilization and violence are antithetical concepts. Negroes of the United States following the people of India, have demonstrated that nonviolence is not sterile passivity, but a powerful moral force which makes for social transformation. And sooner or later, all the people of the world will have to discover a way to live together in peace. And the world will have to discover this same way, and thereby transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. If this is to be achieved, man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. From the depths of my heart, I am aware that this prize is much more than an honor to me personally. Every time I take a flight, I am always mindful of the many people who have made this successful journey possible. The known pilots and the unknown ground crew. So you honor the dedicated pilots of our struggle who have sat at the controls as the freedom movement soared into orbit. You honor once again Chief Albert Lutherly of South Africa, whose struggles with and for his people are still met with the most brutal expression of a man's inhumanity to man. You honor the ground crew, without whose labor and sacrifices the jet flights to freedom could never have left the earth. Most of these people will never make the headlines, and their names will not appear in Who's Who. Yet the years have rolled past, and when the blazing light of truth is focused on this marvelous age in which we live, men and women will know, and children will be taught that we have a finer land, a better people, a more noble civilization, because these humble children of God were willing to suffer for righteousness' sake. I think Alfred Nobel would know what I mean when I say that I accept this award in the spirit of the curator of some precious heirloom which he holds in truth for its true owners. All those to whom beauty, beauty, and in those whose eyes the beauty of genuine brotherhood and peace is more precious than diamonds or silver or gold. The tortuous road which we have led from Montgomery, Alabama to Oslo bears witness to this truth. This is a road over which millions of Negroes are traveling to find a new sense of dignity. This same road has opened for all Americans a new era of progress and hope. It has led to a new civil rights bill, and it will, I am convinced, be widened and lengthened into a superhighway of justice as Negro and white men increasingly go into a number to create alliance to overcome their common problems. I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind. I refuse to accept the idea that isness of a man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal altness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere floatism or jetsism in the river of life which surrounds him. I refuse to accept the view that man alone is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I refuse to accept the cynical notion that nation after nation must spiral down a militaristic stairway into hell of thermonuclear destruction. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. That is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant. I believe that even amid today's mortar bursts and whining bullets, there is still hope for a brighter tomorrow. I believe that wounded justice lying prostrate on the blood-flowing streets of our nations can be lifted from the dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men. I have the audacity to believe that peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. I believe that what self-centered men have torn down, men other-centered can build up. I still believe that one day mankind will bow before the altars of God and be crowned triumphant over war and bloodshed, and nonviolent redemptive good it will proclaim the rule of the land. And the lion and the lamb shall lie down together, and every man shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid. I still believe that we will overcome. This faith can give us courage to face the uncertainties of the future. It will give our tired feet a new strength as we continue our forward stride toward the city of freedom. When our days become dreary with low hovering clouds and our nights become darker than 1,000 midnights, we will know that we are living in a creative turmoil of a genuine civilization struggling to be born. Today, I accept this award, and I come to Oslo as a trustee, inspired, and with a renewed dedication to humanity. I accept this prize on behalf of all men who believe in peace and brotherhood.
Walk for freedom. The present protest here in Montgomery on the part of the Negro citizens grows out of many experiences that have often been humiliating and have led to deep resentment. The Negro citizens of Montgomery compose about 75% of the bus riders. In riding buses, they have confronted conditions which have made for a great deal of embarrassment, such as having to stand over empty seats, having to pay fares at the front door and going out to the back to get on, and then the very humiliating experience of being arrested for refusing to get up and give a seat to a person of another race. These conditions and those experiences have now reached the point that the Negro citizens are tired, and this tiredness was expressed on December 5th, when more than 99% of the Negro bus riders decided not to ride the bus in a protest against these unjust conditions. This protest has lasted now for many, many weeks and is still in process. From the beginning, we have insisted on nonviolence. This is a protest, a nonviolent protest against injustice. We are demanding on moral and spiritual forces. To put it in another way, this is a movement of passive resistance, and the great instrument is the instrument of love. We feel that this is our chief weapon, and that no matter how long we are violent in the protests, no matter how tragic the experiences are, no matter what sacrifices we have to make, we will not let anybody drag us so low as to hate them. Love must be at the forefront of our movement if it is to be a successful movement. And when we speak of love, we speak of understanding, goodwill toward all men. We speak of a creative, a redemptive sort of love, so that as we look at the problem, we see that the real tension is not between the Negro citizens and the white citizens of Montgomery, but it is a conflict between justice and injustice, between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And if there is a victory, and there will be a victory, the victory will not be merely for the Negro citizens and the defeat for the white citizens, but it will be a victory for justice and a defeat of injustice. It will be a victory of goodness in its long struggle with the forces of evil. This is a spiritual moment, and we intend to keep these things in the forefront. We know that violence will defeat our purpose. We know that in our struggle in America and in our specific struggle here in Montgomery, violence will not only be impractical, but immoral. We are outnumbered. We do not have access to the instruments of violence. Even more than that, not only is violence impractical, but it is immoral. For it is my firm conviction that to seek to retaliate with violence does nothing but intensify the existence of evil and hate in the universe. Along the way of life, someone must have sense enough and mortality enough to cut off the chain of hate and evil. The greatest way to do that is through love. I believe firmly that love is a transforming power that can lift the whole community to new horizons of fair play, goodwill, and justice. Love is our greatest instrument and our great weapon, and that alone. On January 30th, my home was bombed. My wife and my baby were there. I was attending a meeting. I first heard of the bombing at the meeting when someone came to me and mentioned it, and I tried to accept it in a very calm manner. I first inquired about my wife and daughter. Then after I found out they were all right, I stopped in the midst of meeting and spoke to the group and urged them not to be panicky and not to do anything about it because that was not the way. I immediately came home, and on entering the front of the house, I noticed there were some 500 to 1,000 persons. I came in the house and looked it over and went back to see my wife and to see the baby girl. The baby was all right. But as I stood in the back of the house, hundreds and hundreds of people were still gathering. And I saw there that violence was a possibility. It was at that time that I went to the porch and tried to say to the people that we could not allow ourselves to be panicky. We could not allow ourselves to retaliate with any type of violence, but that we were to still to confront the problem with love. One statement that I made, and I believe it to be firmly, was, "He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword." I urge the people to continue to manifest love and to continue to carry on the struggle with the same dignity and with the same discipline that we had started out with. I think at that time the people did decide to go home. Things did get quiet, and it ended up with a great deal of calmness and a great deal of discipline, which I think our community should be proud of, and which I was very proud to see because our people were determined not to retaliate with violence. Some 26 of the ministers and almost 100 of the citizens of the city were indicted in this boycott. But we realized in the beginning that we would confront experiences that make for great sacrifices, experiences that are not altogether pleasant. We decided among ourselves that we would stand up to the finish, and that what we are to determine to do. In the midst of the indictments, We still hold to this nonviolent attitude of this primacy of love. Even though convicted, we will not retaliate with hate, but will stand with love in our hearts and stand resisting injustice with the same determination with which we started out. We need a great deal of encouragement in this moment. Of course, one thing that we are depending on from not only other communities but from our own community is prayer. We ask people everywhere to pray that God will guide us, pray that justice will be done and that righteousness will stand. And I think through these prayers, we will be strengthened. It will make us feel the unity of the nation and the presence of Almighty God. For as we said all along, this is a spiritual movement.
Who speaks for the South? The history of our nation is the history of a long and tireless effort to broaden the franchise of American citizens. At the very birth of our nation, a great struggle had to be made to secure the ballot for people who did not own property. Even among the founding fathers, there were men who felt that only those who owned property should have the right to vote. Over this issue, a mighty struggle took place. When, after many long years, this fight was successfully won, a great effort was made by women seeking to obtain the franchise. Again, after weary decades of agitation, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution opened a new chapter in the lives of women and in the life of our nation. Thus, we see that from 1789 to 1920, disenfranchised Americans fought and won their basic right to vote. However, for the Negroes of the South, there was still no ballot. Whether they owned property or were penniless, whether male or female, these American victories in the extension of democracy did not affect them. But this history does not provide a profound lesson for the voiceless Negroes. It teaches us how a struggle is won. We see that the poor men of 1776 did not accept disenfranchisement without protest. In a legal manner, these pioneers fought hard for the vote, as they had to fight for the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord. Later, when women decided the time had come for them to vote, they were far from submissive or silent. They cried out in the halls of government. They agitated in their homes. They protested in the streets. They were jailed. They pressed on. Their voices were vigorous, even strident, but they were always effective. Through their courage, their steadfastness, their unity, and their willingness to sacrifice, they won the right to vote. From these women, we have learned how social changes take place through struggle. And in this same tradition of determination, of confidence in the justice of a cause, Negroes must now demand the right to vote. And these qualities of courage, perseverance, unity, sacrifice, plus a nonviolence of spirit are the weapons we must depend on if we are to vote with freedom. America must begin the struggle for democracy at home. The advocacy of free elections in Europe by American officials is hypocrisy when free elections are not held in the great sections of America. To Negro Americans, it is ironic to be governed, to be taxed, to be given orders, but to have no representation in a nation that would defend the right to vote abroad. We have a duty to deliver our nation from this snare and from this delusion. Let us make our intentions crystal clear. We must and we will be free. We want freedom now. We want the right to vote now. We do not want freedom fed to us in the teaspoons over another 150 years. Under God, we were born free. Misguided men robbed us of our freedom. We want it back. We would keep it forever. No, this is not idle chatter, for we know that sacrifice is involved, that brutality will be faced, that salvage conduct will need to be endured, that slick trickery will need to be overcome, but we are resolutely prepared for all of this. We are prepared to meet whatever comes with love, with firmness, and with unyielding nonviolence. We are prepared to press on this unceasingly and persistently to obtain our birthright and to hand down to our children and to their children's children. And already this struggle has had its sacred martyrs. The Reverend George Washington Lee, shot and killed in Mississippi. Mr. and Mrs. Harry Moore, bombed and murdered in Florida. Emmett Till, a mere boy unqualified to vote, but seemingly used as a victim to terrorize Negro citizens and keep them from the polls. While the blame for this grisly mutilation of Till has been placed upon two cruel men, the ultimate responsibility is for this and other tragic events must rest with the American people themselves. It rests with all of us, black and white, who call ourselves civilized men. For democracy demands responsibility, courage, and the will to freedom from all men. There is blood on the hands of those who halt the progress of our nation and frustrate the advancement of its people by coercion and violence. But despite this, it is our responsibility to pray for those who mistreat us. We must pray for change of attitude in all those who violate human dignity and who rob men, women, and little children of human decency. We must pray for ourselves, that we shall have the strength to move forward each day, knowing that our every act can emancipate us and can add compassion to the heart of our nation. We must pray for the power that comes from loving our neighbor as we love ourselves, because all men are one. The revolution for American freedom affects the entire world. And in the same manner, freedom for the American Negro will affect the lives of all people in the South for the better, just as the absence of Negro freedom has affected the lives of all Americans for the worst. This can be seen from the tragic consequences that insecurities that have emerged from the disenfranchisement of Negroes in the South. The ghastly results have not been borne along by the Negro. Poor white men, women, and children bearing the scars of ignorance, deprivation, and poverty are evidence of the fact that harm to one is injury to all. They too are victims of the one-party system that has developed in the South, a system that denies freedom of political choice and real political expression to millions of white voters. And with a limited electorate capable of being manipulated, reactionary men gained access to the highest legislative bodies of government. And today, because the Negro cannot vote, Congress is dominated by Southern senators and representatives who are not elected in fair nor in a legal manner. The strategic position of these men as chairman of the most important committees in the House and Senate enables them to filibuster and to bottle up legislation urgently needed for the economic and social welfare of all Americans, Negro and white. Hence, it may clearly be seen that it is not the Negro alone who suffers, but the nation as a whole. Governor Griffin, who recently called for a poll tax to reduce the Negro vote in Georgia, Senator Eastland, and men who hold their views do not, I am thoroughly confident, speak for the South. I believe that voices like those of Miss Lillian E. Smith of Georgia, Mr. Harry Ashmore of Arkansas, and the ever-growing list of the white Christian ministers, such as the group that recently issued a statement in Atlanta, Georgia. These voices represent the true and basic sentiments of millions of Southerners whose voices are yet unheard, whose course is yet unclear, and whose courage and their acts are yet unseen. In the name of God, and in the interest of human dignity, and for the cause of democracy, I appeal to these millions to grid their courage, to speak out, and to act on their basic convictions. In their hearts, the white Southerners know the loyalty, the courage, and the democratic responsibility of the Negro people. Beyond this, they know that we are dedicated to nonviolence. Just as I have urged Negroes to face the calculated risk involved in resisting injustice nonviolently, I implore the white Southerner of goodwill to face the calculated risk that working openly for justice and freedom demand. We Southerners, Negro and white, must no longer permit our heritage to be dishonored before the world. And the South should know that the effort of Negroes to vote is not merely a matter of exercising rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution. The question is beyond rights. We have a duty to perform. We have a moral obligation to carry out. We have the duty to remove from political domination a small minority that cripples the economic and social institutions of our country and thereby degrades and improvises everyone. We have a duty.
Our God is marching on. My dear and abiding friends, Ralph Abernathy, and to all of the distinguished Americans seated here on the rostrum, my friends and co-workers of the state of Alabama, and to all of the freedom-loving people who have assembled here this afternoon from all over our nation and from all over the world. Last Sunday, more than 8,000 of us started on a mighty walk from Selma, Alabama. We have walked through desolate valleys and across the trying hills. We have walked on meandering highways and rested our bodies on rocky byways. Some of our faces are burned from the outpouring of the sweltering sun. Some have literally slept in the mud. We have been drenched by the rains. Our bodies are tired and our feet are somewhat sore. But today, as I stand before you and think back over the Great March, I can say, as Sister Pollard said, a 70-year-old Negro woman who lived in this community during the bus boycott. And one day, she was asked while walking if she didn't want to ride. And when she answered no, the person said, "Well, aren't you tired?" And with her ungrammatical profundity, she said, "My feet is tired, but my soul is rested." And in a real sense, this afternoon, we can say that our feet are tired, but our souls are rested. They told us we wouldn't get here, and there were those who said that we would get here only over their dead bodies. But all the world today knows that we are here and we are standing before the forces of the power in this state of Alabama, saying we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. Now, it is not an accident that one of the great marches of American history should terminate in Montgomery, Alabama. Just 10 years ago, in this very city, a new philosophy was born of the Negro struggle. Montgomery was the first city in the South in which the entire Negro community united, and in the South in which the entire community was united and squarely faced its age-old oppressors. Out of this struggle, more than bus desegregation was won. A new idea more powerful than guns or clubs were born. Negroes took it and carried it across the South in epic battles that electrified the nation and the world. Yes, strangely, the climatic conflicts always were fought and won on Alabama soil. After Montgomery's heroic confrontations loomed in Mississippi, Arkansas, Georgia, and elsewhere, but not until the colossus of segregation was challenged in Birmingham did the conscience of America begin to bleed. White America was profoundly aroused by Birmingham because it witnessed the whole community of Negroes facing terror and brutality with majestic scorn and heroic courage. And from the wells of this democratic spirit, the nation finally forced Congress to write legislation in the hope that it would eradicate the stain of Birmingham. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave Negroes some part of their rightful dignity, but without the vote, it was dignity without strength. Once more, the method of nonviolent resistance was unshedded from its scabbard, and once again, an entire community was mobilized to confront the adversary. And again, the brutality of dying order shrieks across the land. Yet Selma, Alabama, became a shining moment in the conscience of man. If the worst in American life lurked in these dark streets, the best of American instincts aroused passionately from across the nation to overcome it. There never was a moment in American history more honorable, more inspiring than the pilgrimage of clergymen and laymen of every race and faith pouring into Selma to face danger at the side of its embattled Negroes. The confrontation of good and evil compressed in the tiny community of Selma generated the massive power to turn the whole nation to a new course. A president born in the South had the sensitivity to feel the will of the country, and in an address that will live in history as one of the most passionate pleas for human rights ever made by a president of our nation, he pledged the might of the federal government to cast off the centuries-old blight. President Johnson rightly praised the courage of the Negro for awakening the consciousness of the nation. On our part, we must pay our profound respect to the white Americans who cherish their democratic tradition over the ugly custom and privileges of generations and come forth boldly to join hands with us. From Montgomery to Birmingham, from Birmingham to Selma, from Selma back to Montgomery, a trail wound in a circle long, often bloody, yet it has become a highway up from darkness. Alabama has tried to nurture and defend evil, but evil is choking to death in the dusty roads and the streets of this state. So I stand before you this afternoon with the conviction that segregation is on its deathbed in Alabama. And the only thing I'm certain about it is how costly the segregationists in Wallace will make the funeral. Our whole campaign in Alabama has been centered around the right to vote, in focusing the attention of the nation and the world today on the flagrant denial of the right to vote. We are exposing the very origin, the root cause of racial segregation in the Southland. Racial segregation as a way of life did not come about as a natural result of hatred between the races immediately after the Civil War. There was no law segregating the races then, and as the noted historian C. Van Woodard in his book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, clearly points out, the segregation of the races was really a political stratagem that was employed by the emerging bourbon interests in the South to keep the Southern masses divided and Southern laborers the cheapest in the land. You see, it was a simple thing to keep the poor white masses working for near starvation wages in the years that followed the Civil War. Why is that? Because if the poor white plantation or mill worker became dissatisfied with his low wages, the plantation or mill owner would merely threaten to fire them and hire former Negro slaves and pay them even less wages. Thus, the Southern wage level was kept almost unbearably low. Toward the end of the resurrection or the Reconstruction era, something very significant happened. That is what was known as the populist movement. The leaders of this movement became awakening the poor white masses and the former Negro slaves to the fact that they were being fleeced by the emerging bourbon interests. Not only that, but they began uniting the Negro and white masses into a voting bloc that threatened to drive the bourbon interests from the command post of political power in the South. And to meet this threat, the Southern aristocracy began immediately to engineer this development of a segregated society. And I want you to follow me through here because this is very important to see the roots of racism and the denial of the right to vote through their control of mass media. They revised the doctrine of white supremacy. They saturated the thinking of the poor white masses with it, and thus clouding their minds to the real issue involved in the populist movement. They then directed the placement of the books of the South of the laws that made it a crime for Negroes and whites to come together as equal at any level. And that did it. That crippled and eventually destroyed the populist movement of the 19th century. If it may be said of the slavery era that the white man took the world and gave the Negro Jesus, than it may be said of the Reconstruction era, that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. He gave him Jim Crow, and when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man, better than the black man. And he ate Jim Crow. And when his undernourished children cried out for the necessities that this low wages could not provide, he showed them the Jim Crow signs on the buses and in the stores, on the streets and in the public buildings. And his children too learned to feed upon Jim Crow, the last outpost of psychological oblivion. Thus, the threat of the free exercise of the ballot by the Negro and the white masses alike resulted in the establishment of a segregated society. They segregated Southern money from the poor whites. They segregated Southern morals from the rich whites. They segregated Southern churches from Christianity. They segregated Southern minds from human thinking. That they segregated the Negro from everything. And that's what happened when the Negro and the white masses of the South threatened to unite and build a great society, a society of justice where none would prey upon the weakness of others, a society of plenty where greed and poverty would be done away, a society of brotherhood where every man would respect the dignity and the worth of human personality. Oh, we've come a long way since that travesty of justice was perpetrated upon the American mind. James Weldon Johnson put it eloquently. He said, "We have come over a way that with tears have been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughter, out of the gloomy past, till now we stand at last where the white gleam of our bright star is cast." Today I want to tell the city of Selma. Today I want to say to the state of Alabama. Today I want to say to the people of America and the nations of the world that we are not about to turn around. We're on the move now. Yes, we're on the move, and no wave of racism can stop us. We're on the move now. The burning of our churches will not deter us. The bombing of our homes will not dissuade us. We're on the move now. The beating and the killing of our clergymen and young people will not divert us. We're on the move now. The wanton release of their known murderers will not discourage us. We're on the move now. Like an ideal whose time has come, not even the marching of mighty armies can halt us. We are moving to the land of freedom. Let us therefore continue our triumphant march to the realization of the American dream. Let us march on segregated housing until every ghetto or social and economic depression dissolve, that Negroes and whites live side by side in decent, safe, and sanitary housing. Let us march on segregated schools until every vestige of segregated and inferior education become a thing of the past, and Negroes and whites can study side by side in the socially healing context of the classroom. Let us march on poverty until no American parent has to skip a meal so that their child may eat. We're on the move now until no starved man walks the streets of our cities and our town. Let us march on poverty until wrinkled stomachs in Mississippi are filled and the idle industries of the Appalachia are realized and revitalized, and broken lives in sweltering ghettos are mended and remolded. Let us march on the ballot boxes, march on ballot boxes until race baiters disappear from the political arena. Let us march on ballot boxes until the Wallaces of our nation tremble away inside. And let us march on ballot boxes until we send to our city councils, our state legislators, and the United States Congress men who will not fear to do justly, but love mercy and walk humbly before God. Let us march on the ballot boxes until brotherhood becomes more than a meaningless word in an opening prayer, but the order of the day on every legislative agenda. There's nothing wrong with marching in this sense. The Bible tells us that the mighty man of Joshua merely walked around the walled city of Jericho, and the barriers to freedom came tumbling down. I like that old Negro spiritual. Joshua fit the battles of Jericho in its simple yet colorful depiction of that great moment in biblical history. It tells us that Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls come tumbling down. Up to the walls of Jericho they marched, spear in hand. Go blow them ram horns, Joshua cried, because the battle am in my hand. These words I have given you just as they were given us by the unknown, long dead, dark-skinned originator. Some now long gone black bard bequeathed to posterity these words in ungrammatical form, yet with emphatic pertinence for all of us today. The battle is in our hands, and we can answer this creative nonviolence, the call to higher ground to which the new direction of our struggle summons us. The road ahead is not altogether a smooth one. There are no broad highways that lead us easily and inevitably to quick solution, but we must keep going. In glow of the lamplight on my desk a few nights ago, I gazed again upon the wondrous signs of our time, full of hope and promise of the future. And I smiled to see in the newspaper photographs of many a decade ago, the faces that was so bright, so solemn of our valiant heroes, the people of Montgomery. And to this list may be added the names of all those who have fought and, yes, died in the nonviolent army of our day. Medgar Evers, 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi last summer. William Moore, as he already been mentioned. The Reverend James Reeb, Jimmy Lee Jackson, and those 4 little girls in the Church of God in Birmingham on Sunday morning. But in spite of this, we must go on and be sure that they did not die in vain. The pattern of their feet as they walk through Jim Crow barriers and the great stride toward freedom is the thunder of the marching men of Joshua, and the world rocks beneath their tread. My people, all my people, listen. The battle is in our hands. The battle is in our hands in Mississippi and Alabama and all over the United States. I know there's a cry today in Alabama. We see it in its numerous editorials. When will Martin Luther King, SCLCC, SNCC, and all of these civil rights agitators and all of the white clergymen and labor leaders and students and others get out of our community and let Alabama return to normalcy? Well, I have a message that I would like to leave with Alabama this evening. That is exactly what we don't want, and we will not allow it to happen. For we know that if it was normalcy in Marion that led to the brutal murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson, it was normalcy in Birmingham that led to the murder on Sunday morning of those 4 beautiful young girls, offending young innocent girls. It was normalcy on Highway 80 that led state troopers to use tear gas and horses and billy clubs against unarmed human beings who were simply marching for justice. It was normalcy in the cafe in Selma, Alabama that led to the brutal beating of Reverend James Rebb. It was normalcy all over our country. which leaves the Negro perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. It is normacy all over Alabama that prevents the Negro from becoming a registered voter. No, we will not allow Alabama to return to normacy. The only normacy that we will settle for is the normacy that recognizes the dignity and the worth of all of God's children. The only normacy that we will settle for is the normacy that allows judgment to run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. The only normacy that we will settle for is the normacy of brotherhood, the normacy of true peace, the normacy of justice. And so as we go away this afternoon, let us go away more than ever before committed to the struggle and committed to nonviolence. I must admit to you that there are still some difficult days ahead. We are still in for a season of suffering in many of the Black Belt counties of Alabama, many areas of Mississippi, many areas of Louisiana. I must admit to you that there are still jail cells waiting for us and dark and difficult moments. But if we go on with the faith that nonviolence and its power can transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows, we will be able to change all of these conditions. And so I plead with you this afternoon as we go ahead, remain committed to nonviolence. Our aim must never be to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding. We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience, and that this will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man, that will be the day of man as man. I know you're asking today, how long would it take, Dr. King? Somebody is asking, how long will prejudice blind the vision of men, darken their understanding, and drive bright-eyed wisdom from her sacred throne? Somebody's asking, when will wounded justice lying prostrate on the streets of Selma and at Birmingham and communities all over the South be lifted from this dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men? Somebody's asking, when will the radiant star of hope be plunged against the nocturnal bosom of this lonely night? Plucked from weary souls with chains of fear and the manacles of death. How long will justice be crucified and truth buried? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed the earth will rise again. How long? Not long. No lie will live forever. How long? Not long, because you shall reap what you sow. How long? Not long, because truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. How long? Not long, because the arc of the more universe is long, but it bends towards justice. How long? Not long, because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is tramping out the vintage where the grapes are wrapped a storm. He has loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on. Glory. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
I would like to discuss some of the problems we confront in the world today, and some of the problems that we confront in our own nation by using as a subject the American dream. I chose the subject because America is essentially a dream. It is a dream of a land where men of all races, of all nationalities and all creeds can live together as brothers. The substance of the dream is expressed in these sublime words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now we notice in the very beginning that at the center of this dream is an amazing universalism. It does not say some men, but it says all men. It does not say all white men, but it says all men, which includes black men. It does not say all Gentiles, but it says all men, which includes Jews. It does not say all Protestants, but it says all men, which includes Catholics. That is something else that we noticed in this American dream, which is one of the things that distinguishes our form of government with some of the other totalitarian systems. It says that each individual has certain inalienable and inherent rights that are neither derived from our conferred state, they are gifts from the hands of the Almighty God. Very seldom, if ever, in the history of the world has a socio-political document expressed in such profound, eloquent, and unequivocally language the dignity and the worth of human personality. While the American dream reminds us that every man is an heir of legacy of worthfulness, but even since the founding fathers of our nation dreamed this dream, America has been something of a schizophrenic personality. On the one hand, we have proudly professed the noble principles of democracies. On the other hand, we have sadly practiced the very antithesis of those principles. Indeed, slavery and segregation have been strange paradoxes in a nation founded on the principles that all men are created equal. But now more than ever before, America is challenged to realize its noble dream. For the shape of the world today does not permit us the luxury of an academic democracy. And the price that the United States must pay for the continued exploitation and oppression of the Negro and other minority groups is the price of its own destruction. There are approximately 2,700,000,000 people in the world, and the vast majority of these people live in Asia and Africa. For years, most of these people have been dominated by political, exploited, economically segregated, and humiliated by some foreign power. Today, they are gaining that independence. More than 1,600,000,000 of the former 1,900,000,000 colonial subjects have their independence today, and they are saying no subjects have their independence today, and they are saying in no uncertain terms that racism and colonialism must go. So in a real sense, our hour is late, and the clock of destiny is ticking, and we must act now before it is too late. It is trite, but urgently true, that if America is to remain a first-class nation, she can no longer have second-class citizens. I must rush on to say that we must not seek to solve the problem merely to meet the communist challenge. We must not seek to do it merely to appeal the Asian and American people. In the final analysis, racial discrimination must be uprooted from our society because it is morally wrong. It must be done because segregation stands against all the noble precepts of our Judeo-Christian heritage. It must be done because segregation substitutes an I, its relationship for the I, thou relationships, and ends of regulating persons to the status of things. And so this problem must be solved, not merely because it is diplomatically expedient, but because it is morally compelling. So every person of goodwill in this nation is called upon to work passionately and unrelentingly to realize the American dream. And the persons who are working to do this are not dangerous alligators. They're not dangerous rabble rousers, but they are the persons working to save the souls of America. Man, through his scientific genius, has been able to dwarf differences and place time in chains. Yes, he's been able to carve highways through the stratosphere, and our jet planes have compressed into minute distances that once took days. I think Bob Hope would adequately describe this new jet age in which we live, and it is not the usual thing for a preacher to be quoting Bob Hope, but I think he has adequately described this new jet age. He said, "It is an age in which it is possible to take a nonstop flight from Los Angeles to New York, and in taking off in Los Angeles, you develop hiccups. You will hic in Los Angeles and cup in New York City." Now, though our moral, ethical commitment is here, we must make of it a brotherhood, and we must learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. Every individual must learn this. Every nation must learn this. Every nation must realize its dependency on other nations. Some months ago, Mrs. King and I journeyed to that great country known as India. And I never forgot, or I never will forget the experience. I never will forget many of the conversations, experience to talk with the great leaders of India and to meet people in the cities and the villages throughout the nation will remain dear to me as long as the cords of memory let them. I must say to you this evening that there were those depressing moments. How can one avoid being depressed when he sees with his own eyes millions of people going to bed hungry at night? How can one avoid being depressed when he sees with his own eyes millions of people sleeping on the sidewalks at night? In Calcutta alone, more than 1 million people sleep on the sidewalks every night. They have no beds to sleep in. They have no houses to go in. How can one avoid being depressed when he discovers that out of this experience? How can one avoid being depressed when he discovers that out of India's population of 4 million, more than 370 million make an annual income of less than $60 a year? Most of these people have never seen a doctor or a dentist. And as I noticed these conditions, something within me cried out. Can we in America stand idly by and not be concerned? An answer came, oh no, because the destiny of the United States is tied up with the destiny of India. And I started thinking of the fact here in America, we spend more than 1 million a day to start surplus food. And I said to myself, I know where we can store that food free of charge, in the wrinkled stomachs of the millions of people all over the world who go to bed hungry at night. Maybe we've spent far too much of our money establishing military bases around the world rather than bases of genuine concern and understanding. All I'm saying is simply this, that life is interrelated. We are tied in an inescapable network of mutuality, in a single garment of destiny. And whatever it affects, whatever it affects one directly, it affects indirectly. And as long as there is extreme poverty in this world, no one can be totally rich, even if he has $1 billion. As long as diseases are rampant and millions of people cannot expect to live more than 28 or 30 years, no one can totally be healthy, even if he just got a checkup. In the finest clinic of the nation, strangely enough, I can never be, or I can never say what I ought to be and say until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. And certainly, this has been pointed out by authorities and scholars. It has been pointed out by anthropological sciences, Margaret Mead, Melvin Hertzschwartz. Others have made it clear, and there are no superior races. They may be superior and inferior individuals academically within our races, but no superior or inferior races. That somehow there are 4 types of blood, and they are found in our races. But in spite of this, the notion still lingers. There was a time that people tried to justify racial inferiority on the basis of the Bible and religion. And so someone could argue that the Negro is inferior by nature because of Noah's curse upon the children of Ham. And Paul's dictum became a watch where he became obedient to his master. And then there was one brother who had probably read the logic of Aristotle. Aristotle used to deal with the syllogism, which had a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And one brother put his argument in the framework of the Aristotelian syllogism. He called, or he could have called and said, all men are made in the image of God. This was the major premise. And then came the minor premise. God has everybody, as everybody knows, is not a Negro. Therefore, the Negro is not a man. This was the type of reasoning that was used at the time to justify the inferiority of the Negro. But now it isn't done so much on the biblical religious ground. It's something else. It's argued on subtle sociological and cultural grounds. And so we hear these things from time to time. The Negro is not culturally ready for integration. And of course, if you integrate the schools and if you integrate public facilities, the Negro will pull the white race back a generation. And then there are those who are going to argue that the Negro is a criminal. He's innately a criminal. They will say he lags behind in all of his standards. So they use these subtle sociological arguments to say that integration should take place 100 years from now. You must lift these standards. That they would argue. Well, the only answer that we can give is that if there are lagging standards in the Negro community, they lag because of segregation and discrimination. We must say to them that poverty, ignorance, and disease breed crime, whatever the racial background or group may be. These things are environmental and not racial, and it is a tortuous logic to use the tragic results of segregation as an argument for the continuation of it. The thing to do is to get rid of the casual biases. And so we must get rid of the notion once and for all if we are to realize the American dream. And so from an old slave cabin of Virginia's Hill, Booker T. Washington rose up to be one of America's greatest leaders. He lit a torch in Alabama, then darkness fled. From the red hills of Gordon County, Georgia, and iron foundry of Chattanooga, Tennessee, in the arms of a mother who couldn't even read or write. Roland Hayes rose up to be one of the world's greatest singers and carried his melodious voice into the palace of King George V and the mansions of Queen Mother of Spain. From a poverty-stricken area to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Marian Anderson rose up to be the world's greatest contralto, so that Tuskegee could say that a voice like this comes once in a century. George Washington Carver rose up and carved for himself an imperishable niche in the annals of science. And there was a star in the sky to female leadership. And then came Mary McLeod Bethune, and she grabbed it and allowed it to shine in her life, all of its radiant beauty. And there was a star in the diplomatic sky. And then came Ralph Bunche, the grandson of a slave preacher, and allowed it to shine in his life beautiful terms. All these people have revealed the myth of radical inferiority cannot stand. They have justified the conviction of the poor. Fleecy locks and black complexion cannot fault that nature's claim. Skin may differ, but affliction dwells in black and white the same. And while so tall as to reach the pole, or to grasp at the ocean at span, I must measure by my soul, and the mind is or ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated struggle of reality. And certainly, this has been pointed out by authorities and scholars. It has been pointed out by anthropological sciences. Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, Melville, and others have made it clear that there are no superior races. There may be superior and inferior individuals academically within our races, but no superior or inferior races. That somehow there are 4 types of blood, and they are found in all races. But in spite of all this, the notion still lingers. There was a time that people tried to justify racial inferiority on the basis of the Bible and religion. And so someone could argue that the Negro is inferior by nature because Noah's curse upon the children of Ham, and Paul's dictum because of Noah became a watch, wherein also in obedience to the master. And then there was one brother who had probably read the logic of Aristotle. Aristotle used to deal with the syllogisms, which had a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. We must say to them that poverty, ignorance, and disease breeds crime, whatever the racial group may be. These things are environmental, not racial. It is a tutorial's logic to use the tragic results of segregation as an argument for the continuation of it. The thing to do is to get rid of the causal basis. And so we must get rid of the notion once and for all that if we are to realize the American dream, that there are superior and inferior, that there are no superior but inferior races. And I think we already have numerous and inspiring examples of Negroes who have demonstrated that human nature cannot be cataloged, and who have successfully refuted the myths of racial inferiority, in spite of the fact that the Negro has had to walk through the long and desolated night of oppression. He has risen up so often to plunge against cloud-filled nights of affliction. And so from an old slave cabin on Virginia Hill, Booker T. Washington rose to be one of the greatest leaders. He lit a torch in Alabama, then darkness fled. And so Darwin is right at that point, but when a Herbert Spencer seeks to apply the whole of society, that is little evidence for it. Human progress never rolls on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tiredness, efforts, and the persistent work of dedicated individuals. And without this hard work, time itself becomes the reality, an insurgent primitive force of irrational emotionalism and social stagnation, so that we must somehow get rid of this idea that time alone will solve the problem. We must use time. Another idea is the idea of the myth, or what I call educational determination. It is the idea that only education will solve this problem. I am sure you heard this, that you've got to change the hearts of people, and people must be educated to the point. And people must be educated to the point that they will change their attitudes. Now, there's some truth in this, but to say this is the only thing that but to say this is the only thing is where we develop the myth. It is not either education or legislation. It is both education and legislation. Now it may be true that you cannot legitimately be moral. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep people from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important also. This is what we seek to do through the law, to control the external effects of bad internal feelings. Religion and education would have to change the attitudes, but legislation, executive orders, judicial decree will have to control the external effects of bad internal attitudes. Therefore, we are to realize the American dream. We must continue to work through legislation. So it is necessary for Congress to pass meaningful legislation. It is needed at the present hour, even though the President of our nation does not feel that additional legislation is needed in civil rights. I must respectfully disagree with him. there is need this year, at this hour, for stronger civil rights legislation. Then we must continue to urge the President of this nation to issue executive orders to do away with these barriers. Then we must continue to work through the courts to gain judicial degrees so that these things can be changed. And added to this must be the method of nonviolent directed action. And I am more convinced every day that the most potential weapon available to our oppressed people in that struggle for freedom and human dignity is this weapon of nonviolent resistance. It brings with it many important aspects. It has certain practical consequences, which are all very important. It has a way of disarming the opponent, exposing his moral defenses, weakening his morale, and at the same time, walking and working on his conscience. So he doesn't know exactly how to handle this method. If he puts you in jail, that's all right. If he doesn't put you in jail, that's all right. If he beats you, accept that. If he doesn't beat you, you accept that. If he tries to kill you, you develop the quiet courage of dying, if necessary, without killing. And so he soon discovers that that is no answer for it. And also it has, with certain moral aspects, it makes a possibility for the individuals or the group to secure moral ends through moral means. One of the big problems in history has been in this discussion of ends and means. In the long run, the history of destructive means cannot justify constructive ends because the end is pre-existent in the means. And so this method of certain moral aspects that go along with the practical, then it is based on the great ethical principle of love. Now, people ask me so often, what in the world do you mean when you say to us, love these people who are trying to destroy us? And these people are trying to defeat us. What do you mean? How can you love people like this? Now, I always have to pause and to try to give the meaning of love in the area of human relations. And fortunately, the Greek language comes to our aid at this point. There are 3 words in the Greek language for love. There's the word eros. This is the sort of aesthetic love. Plato prescribed the standard of man. And so we are challenged to get rid of the notion once and for all that there are inferior and superior races. And people must be educated to the point that they will change their attitudes. Now, there's some truth in this, but to say this is the only legislation or the only thing is where we've developed a myth. It is not either education or legislation. It is both education and legislation. Now, it may be true that you cannot legislate morality. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may not be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep lynching mobs from killing me. This is what we must do in order to realize the American dream. I believe if we would follow these things, we will be able to bring that day into being. But it cannot come until every individual in our nation develops this type of concern. And may I say, as I move toward my conclusion, that this is not just a local problem. People who live in New York and California and Illinois have an obligation to be concerned about the problem, whoever lives in this America. This host of clean hands in the area of brotherhood, we still confront segregation in its glaring and conspicuous forms in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and all over the South. We still confront it in its hidden and subtle forms in Illinois, in California, in Pennsylvania, and even in New York. And if democracy is to live, segregation must die. And we need people all over America who are genuine liberals. It is one thing to rise up with righteous indignation when a Negro is lynched in Mississippi, or when a bus is burned in Anniston, Alabama. But if the person of goodwill were to rise up with as much righteous indignation when a Negro cannot live in his neighborhood because he's a Negro, when a Negro cannot join the professional society or because he's a Negro, when a Negro cannot be a member of his fraternity or sorority, or when a Negro cannot get a position in his firm because he happens to be a Negro, in other words, there must be a concern on the part of people all over this country. And this is the way we solve the problem. There are words that we use in every academic discipline. Pretty soon, these words become a part of the techno-nomenclature to these particular disciplines. Modern psychology has a word that is probably more than any other word than psychology, is a word maladjusted. Maladjusted, and certainly we want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic personalities. And I say to you this evening that there are some things in social order to which I'm proud to be maladjusted. I call upon men of goodwill all over the nation to be maladjusted until the good society is a reality. I never intend to adjust myself to the evils of segregation and discrimination. I never intend to become adjusted to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take away necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. I never intend to become adjusted to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence. And I think now it has come for men all over the nation and all over the world to be maladjusted to all of these things. As maladjusted as the prophet Amos, who in the midst of an injustice of his day could cry out in words that echoes across the centuries, "Let justice run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." As maladjusted as Abraham Lincoln, who had the vision to see that the nation could not exist if slaves are half free. As maladjusted as Thomas Jefferson, who in the midst of an age of amazing adjusted to slavery could cry out in his words lifted to cosmic proportions, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. As maladjusted as Jesus of Nazareth, who could say, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that spitefully use you." And I believe that the world is in desperate need of such maladjustment. And with such maladjustment, we would be able to emerge from the bleak desolated midnight of man's inhumanity to man into the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice. And as we struggle to realize the American dream, let us realize that we do not struggle alone, even though there are difficult days ahead. Even though before the victory is won, somebody else will have to get scared up. Somebody else will have to go to jail. Somebody else will have to face physical death. For the victory is won, someone will be misunderstood, called bad names, be dismissed as dangerous, rabble rousers, and agitators. Even in the midst of that, the struggle must go on, knowing that the victory can be won because the odds of the moral universe I am convinced that is something. That is something in this universe that justifies Carly in saying, no lie can live forever. There's something in the very court of the cosmos which justifies William Cullen Bryant in saying, truth, cursed to earth, will rise again. There is something in this universe which justifies James Russell Lowell in saying, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, yet that scaffold sways the future. And so with this faith in the future, we will be able to adjourn the counsels of the staff from the fatigue of darkness to the buoyancy of hope. And we will be able to bring into being this new society and realize the American dream. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of the chosen black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free.